Okay, in this lesson I'm going to look at our last a couple of questions on hypothesis testing. We've gone through a couple of classes, so make sure you're up to date on the general layout of a hypothesis test and the way we perform it. Okay, so let me read through the question, then we'll go through the various steps. A drugs company produced a new painkiller for migraine. It claimed that the drug had a 90% success rate. Okay, so in other words, 90% of the time it relieved the pain of migraine. A group of doctors doubt the company's claim. They prescribed the drug for 150 patients. After 6 months, 120 patients said their symptoms had been relieved. At the 95% confidence level, can the company's claim be upheld? Now, in our course, the Leaving Cert ordinary level course in Ireland, the 95% confidence level is all we'll be looking at. Okay, and we'll only be looking at hypothesis testing for the proportion. So we're always hypothesis testing for P on our course. There are other hypothesis tests for the mean. The confidence level can change, but on our course, this is all we're looking at. So there are various steps. We always start off by writing down the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis is a claim that has been made about the population. The drugs company claimed the drug had a 90% success rate. So they're claiming that the true population proportion of people whose pain from migraine was relieved by this drug was 90%. 90% of people found this drug relieved the pain of a migraine. That's what they're claiming. It might be true, it might be false. That's what we're testing. The alternative hypothesis is just the absolute opposite of that, which would be that P is not equal to 90%. That's the alternative hypothesis. A couple of things to note. We're going to construct a 95% confidence level. Remember, 95% confidence interval for the proportion. A 95% confidence interval for the proportion follows a formula, and it is this: that we find P hat, we subtract E, that finds the lower limit for my confidence interval, and then we find P hat and we add E, that finds my upper limit. P hat is the sample proportion, E is the margin of error. In this case, to find P hat, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to look at our sample. To find P hat, we're going to look at our sample. There was 150 patients sampled, and 120 said their symptoms had been relieved. So a proportion of people who had relief from this drug is 120 over 50, or over 150, which is 12 over 15, which reduces to 0.8, or 80%. Okay, given that they've said it's a 90% success rate, I'm going to think of that instead of 0.8. I'm going to think of that as 80%. So 12 out of 150, that's 80%. So in our sample, 80% of people found their symptoms had been relieved. So that's P hat taken care of. The second thing I need to do is find the margin of error. And the margin of error on our course is defined as being 1 over root n. It's an approximate thing. On the higher level course, there's a slightly more advanced way of finding it, a more accurate way, I should say. So 1 over root n. 1 over root n. What is n? N is the sample size, so it's 1 over the square root of 150. And again, I'm going to change that into a percentage because the question deals with percentage. We may as well use the language of the question. So when you change that into a percent, I'm getting about 8.1% or 8.2%. And that's just a calculator job. In my calculator, I've typed in 1 over the square root of 150. I've hit equals, I've changed it to a decimal. It's 0.0816, which I'm changing to about 8.2%. Now I'm ready to construct my confidence interval. Here's my formula, P hat minus E, well that's 80%, subtract 8.2%, and the upper limit is 80%, plus 8.2%. Okay, 80 subtract 8, well that's 72, subtract another 0.2, it's going to be 71.8%. And over here, that's straightforward enough, 88.2%. So, remember, from every sample, we've just taken one sample of 150. There'll be loads, an extraordinary huge number of samples of 150 that can be taken. And of those, we're guaranteed that 95% of these intervals will contain the true population proportion. So our thinking is that we are one of the 95% as opposed to one of the 5% of intervals that do not contain the true population proportion. So I suppose you could say we're 95% confident that the true population proportion lies between 71.8 and 88.2%. Okay? So, what do we think? We think that P lies somewhere in between these two things. We can write it in interval notation. I could write it like this. I could say that we think the true population proportion is between 71.8% and 88.2%. So you can use an inequality as well. So what do we think? What do we think about the drugs company claim? Do we think they're telling the truth, or do we think they're lying? Or I suppose a better way to phrase that is, are we going to reject their claim, or are we going to not reject their claim? Remember, we never accept the claim. Okay, so this is my confidence interval. What I'm going to do is make a decision based on this. So the next thing I'm going to write down is my decision. What is my decision? Well, my decision is this. I think the true population proportion is between 88.2 and 71.8. They're saying that's 90, which is not in the interval that I think it is. So I'm going to disagree with them. I am going to reject the claim. Okay, so I'm going to reject the claim. Okay, and how will I word that? Well, the best way to word that, and the reason I'm going to reject that, since the population proportion, the claimed population proportion, 90%, is greater than my upper limit, 88.2. Okay, I could also reject it if it was less than 71.8. Okay, so in this case, we would say there is sufficient evidence to reject the company's claim. Okay, I suppose I should say there is sufficient evidence at the 95% confidence level. To reject the company's claim. So that's how we perform a hypothesis test. We take some claim and we test it. The format is always the same in our course. Write down the null hypothesis, write down the alternative hypothesis, construct your confidence interval. To do that, you need to find P hat and E, and then make a decision based on your confidence interval. Your decision will either say reject or do not reject. It'll give a reason, and then, putting it all into language at the end. Okay, there is sufficient evidence here at the 95% confidence level to reject the company's claim. And that's how we perform a hypothesis test for a claim.